Today we're going to continue our 3-year romp through the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation. We've really only scratched the surface, so to speak. It's a 3-year effort. Today we're going to talk about Jacob's family, who at the time are in Syria or Haran. In Canaan, Isaac instructed Jacob to go to Laban, his uncle, in Haran. And Abraham had stopped there earlier on his way back from Canaan, if you remember, from Mesopotamia. And eventually Abraham left and went down into Canaan with his nephew Lot. And then from Canaan, he's going to send someone back to find a wife for his son Isaac, Rebekah, and he would also find a wife for his other son Jacob in the same way later. Now, this is the trip, of course, that Jacob would have taken from down in the south all the way up to north in Haran. If you were to walk it, that trip might take you 17 to 19 days on foot. If you were me, it would probably take you more like a year. But to get there, the route is going to pass all the way through a city along the way named Bethel. It's a little bit higher north than Jerusalem. To get there, he would have to go through that city, and it's there that Jacob lies down to rest, and he has a very interesting dream. He becomes drowsy at Bethel. So he fluffs up a stone pillow and he settles down for a long night's rest. And we know the story. We've heard that ever since we were children, right? He dreamed of a stairway that led all the way from where he is up into heaven, and descending upon and ascending up to heaven from the earth were angels. Angels were using the ladder to ascend and descend from heaven to earth. I wonder how long of a trip that was. That must have been an extremely long ladder. And during the visits, God offers a promise. And the promise that he made was exactly the same promise that had been made to his grandfather earlier, Abraham. I am your Lord. I am God. I'm the same God that your father and your grandfather have worshipped. You will be blessed, and your descendants will live all throughout this land. And all the people of the world are going to be blessed through you. I love you. I will be with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. You and your descendants will come back to this land, and this is the land that I have promised you. Now, Bethel is an interesting place. It's actually called Beit El. 2 words. Beit means in, and El means God. So it is a place that meant you were in God. You were inside. It's the same word, actually, that is the very first word in the Bible. What's the first word in the Bible? In. It is actually the same word as Beth El. It's in the beginning. In case of Genesis here, it's in God, in El Shaddai, or strength and power. It's an interesting word in and of itself, I suppose. Earlier, his grandfather Abraham stopped here on his way down to Canaan, and Samuel would come here later and establish his home and hold court here. And it's here that 42 children are going to call Elijah Baldy, and a bear is going to come and run them off. I wonder if that bear ate any of those kids. What do you think? I'm going to have to look at that story harder and see if I remember it, but hopefully he just ran them off. I hope he didn't maul them and eat them. Here's a modern day picture of a shepherd and a small flock of goats, and notice that he's standing over a hole in the ground, and he's dipping water from that hole in the ground along the word escapes me, a rope. He has a rope attached to a bucket. He drops the bucket down, pulls water up. Did you know that the rock around that well at the time that Jacob came there was covering the well? Why would they put a rock over the well? Were they trying to lock the people out? Only the people who own the property could use that? Is that what they were doing? So no one would fall in. No bugs and insects and things like that as well. No dirt from up above would fall in and dirty that well. It really was just a covering over. But it was a rock, and at this particular time, or will be in a minute, it's going to be covered. And that well had to be uncovered in order for them to drink from it. Was it fortune that he found Laban's shepherds there? Was it just happenstance, or do you think God had something to do with it? I know this is a lecture class, but I do ask questions occasionally, and so I welcome your thoughts or your comments. But was it fortune, or did God have something to do with it? Clearly, God had to have something to do with it, right? What about the fact that he found Rachel there that very day? You know, we often, yeah. We often see things and wonder, was it God's providence that this happened to us? And we probably don't give enough credence to that. Maybe God really intended for those things to happen the way they did, good or bad perhaps, even in your life for a reason. And it helps us navigate life a little bit better if we think that way, I believe. Well, Jacob couldn't believe his luck or his providence, right? Jacob couldn't believe it. He found the woman that he was going to marry, and he probably knew that right away. God had brought Rachel to the well at just the right time, and Jacob was able to show off his muscles and move that rock away so she could get water that she was looking for. And to find that Rachel was a distant relative, well, it was almost too much to believe, right? Coincidence is a wonderful thing. And when Laban hears the news later, Laban is going to want to come back down here and meet this man Jacob as well. So he comes down and meets the man as well. Now he's already met his wife. His father-in-law comes, and they're all happy, and he knows the trajectory that this story is leading. Is this the only time that well is mentioned in the Bible? Is this the only time it's mentioned? Is there another time that it's mentioned? The Bible tells us that this same well is where Jesus is later going to meet with the Samaritan woman. This is the same well. That well had been around ever since the time of Jacob, and it was the same well that Jesus came along later and said, I am the water of life. The woman didn't understand it, and Jesus preached a wonderful lesson for her and also for us. I am the water of life. It's exactly the same well that we're talking about in this story in the Old Testament. I just found that extremely interesting. Now, Jacob and Esau were twins, right? Were they identical twins? No, they were different, weren't they? They had some very different physical characteristics. We know that Esau was born first, but Jacob came out at the same time Esau did, technically. His little hand came out holding on to some part of Esau, holding on to his ankle, his foot. And that's the reason why we have the expression today, you're pulling my foot, right? You're pulling my leg. You're pulling my leg. He was named Jacob because he was at the very first, it was apparent that he would be usurping his brother. He came out faster than he should have at the same time his brother did, and he, in a sense, was coming out to be the first child, even though he was the second one in line that actually came through. Well, how long did he agree to work for Rachel? How long did I work for you, by the way? How long were we together before? 15 years? Wow. So he worked for 7 years for her, and then when the time was up, of course, Laban tricked him. He brought her sister to him. The Bible says actually he woke up the next morning and there was Leah. Now, I don't know how he could have known. Well, we won't go there. But anyway, he was tricked. Laban explains, well, we thought you understood our customs, Jacob, right? You always marry the older one first, and then the younger one can get married later. And so, in that regard, Jacob was certainly tricked. If he is to be the trickster, he certainly got tricked, didn't he, in this story? Well, this is what Laban told him. Finish out your bridal week obligations. I wonder what that bridal week obligations looked like to people back then. What was it that they had to do for a whole week before those obligations were fulfilled? Whatever it was he had to do it. Laban said, if you do that, if you'll just finish out this week then you can marry Rachel. I'll give you her in exchange then for 7 more years of working for me. What a deal, you know. I'm sure he worked for 7 years thinking, hey, I'm going to marry the girl I wanted to marry now. I'm tired of working for this guy. And all of a sudden he finds out not only is he going to have to work 7 more years, but he got the other daughter, which he didn't really want. It would be like Julie, for instance. Oh, my goodness. And then he's got two wives to deal with instead of one. So, the trickster got tricked, didn't he? He really did. Laban pulled a sweet one off on him. And I'm glad Laban was sure to make things work out the way that he did. So here's a question for you. Was it this? And this is what I was always taught. He worked 7 years, then he got Leah, then he had to work another 7 years, and he got Rachel. Now that's the way I understood it, pretty much from the way they explained the Bible to me back when I was this tall. But I don't think it really quite worked that way. Instead, he worked for 7 years. He finished out his week. He got Leah, then he finished out his week. He was married to Rachel, but then he had to work another 7 years. The whole time he was there, he was married then to both of those daughters of Laban, and he was working for Laban another 7 years before he left. I don't know that's important, but if it's on the admissions test when you come to heaven, you'll be glad we talked about it today, just so you know. Here's a picture of Jacob's family. And all of this is in the Bible in chapters 29 and 30. There's Jacob in the middle. On the one side, he has his wife Leah, the first wife, and her handmaiden that came along with her. So it wasn't really two people we were talking about he had to deal with. It was 4 people, really, because Rachel also brought her handmaiden with her, and her name was Bilhah. And they're going to have relations with all of those women. He's going to have relations with all 4 of them, not just the 2, with all 4 of them. And together then, he's going to have some number of children, which we'll talk about. In 7 years, Jacob is going to have 12 children. Do you know of anyone who had 12 children in 7 years? Is that a possibility even? Yeah, well, okay. With that many women, I suppose, the possibility was great for him to be able to do that. Who comes to your mind when you think about someone having a lot of children up here in Northwest Arkansas? Pardon? Pardon? The Duggars, thank you. I'm sorry I can't hear, and I read lips, but I for whatever reason, can't see today, so I'm in trouble. Well, if you look at this situation and compare it to the Duggars, which is what we'll do in just a second, this situation is made difficult because at one point in time, Leah is going to have a 2-year period where she can't have any children. So then it's left to the rest of them to come up with that 2-year vacancy of having children. But at that point in time, Zilpah got with it and had 2 children. And of course, all of this, 12 children, happened in 7 years. That's a kind of fast track to a full family, isn't it? Well, it did remind me of the Duggars. And what I did was I laid out their children. They're all of them listed here. There were 17 of them. And I thought, is it possible in any way in their life that they could have had 12 children in any of the 7-year periods that they would have had going through all the time up to today? And so far, it has not been possible for them. They'd never had any 12 children in a 7-year period, if you look at it that way. And the way to look at it is called the fecundity rate, where you measure how many months it is between children, and then you would know what your fecundity rate is, but that is your reproductive rate, perhaps. So the average months of birth for Jacob was 11.3. In other words, every 11 months, there was a baby dropping until they filled it all out. Of course, some years it happened a lot sooner than that, but overall the average was 11.33 months a baby would have. What was the average for Jim Bob and Michelle? Well, it was quite a bit longer than that. Actually, it was 17 months. So it didn't happen so quickly as it did with Jacob and his wives. But every 17.3 months, another baby was there. And that was, of course, dated because this is probably about 2 or 3 years old, and they could potentially have had more since then. I don't know. Question?
When you're finished with that, I'd like to
I am finished, sir. You have to come up here and talk. Oh, please. All right.
from this sort of here, we see that sex has no moral quality to it. Sex is
Yeah, right.
a man and a woman coming together. If it had a moral quality to it, there'd be no variation at all. But we see through time, the rules governing sex has changed. And when we come to the New Testament period under Christ, we see that today men don't have 2 or 3 wives. They're not free to marry handmaids. You know, so the rule changes, and that's a little tough to me when I say come to 1 Corinthians and read what Paul says about men and women and wives and authority, etc. That's all I've got to say about it. That
Okay,
it has no moral quality, it has no eternal moral quality to it because it has changed through the ages.
all right. The elders are going to have a meeting this week, and you're going to be invited, brother. I'll tell you, just for what you just said. So get ready for it. Well, the rules may have been modified
There
along
are
the way.
rules that are not, have no moral quality to them. They're not eternal. They change from time to time.
I'll add a new slide in here for that. The next time I teach this, we'll talk about that. Well, by the time Rachel gave birth to their last son, Joseph, Jacob was ready to return home. He'd been tired of working for Laban all this time, right? And we find out Laban was a little bit of an odd character because he's already cheated Jacob, if you will. I'm sure Jacob felt like that. You already kind of pulled the wool over, pardon me, talking about sheep here, but pulled the wool over my eyes a little bit in what you did with me and your 2 daughters. But he continued to work for them, and he served the time that he promised that he would, and he did exactly what he should have done. But his goal of marrying and having wives and having children and building his family up was complete, and he was tired of that, and he was ready to go home. He wanted to return to Israel and get away from his uncle Laban. Well, his uncle got not quite so willing for Jacob to go. You can imagine Jacob was doing all the work around the farm, and he asked Jacob, give me a little more time. Give me another 7 years. Why was 7 a magic term back then? Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I just wondered why 7 was so important. There may be some magical, mystical reason why 7 is always a number that seems to occur routinely on things like this through the Bible. Well, we know the story, right? You were taught this in your Bible classes, I'm sure, at some point in time, all about the sheep and what Jacob did then to kind of make sure that he got the best of the flock before he left. He asked for his share of the sheep and the goats during his labor for his uncle. Pretty simple. But he played a gambit, though. And he asked Laban if he could just separate the sheep so that we have all the clear ones over here and all the spotted and speckled ones over on this side. And his uncle agreed to that. He actually took all of the clean ones away about 3 miles distant from those that were speckled and spotted, and then they started having young sheep. And guess what? By doing that, you're kind of guaranteeing that you're not going to have an intermix of speckled and spotted sheep. And so he asked him, can I just take home with me just the speckled sheep? And Laban said, well, let me count them up. And sure enough, there were a whole lot more unspeckled sheep than there were speckled sheep. And Laban said, yeah, that sounds like a fair deal to me. It was probably more fair for him than it was for Jacob. But Jacob had some ideas, didn't he? He had some ideas about what he could do and some tricks that he could use, hopefully, to turn the tide and bring up the number of speckled sheep so that at the end of that 7 years that he spent there, he would have more sheep than Laban, and he could leave and feel good about the fact of what he had done. But what he did was a little bit interesting. Jacob was not known as the trickster for nothing, and these tricks that he had could turn his fortune around in just a few months. And we're not quite sure how these tricks worked. If you read the Bible, it's not very clear. We understand what Jacob thought would happen when he did it, but we don't know if that really had any impact on what actually occurred. So what did he do? Now again, I lecture a lot, but I'm asking you the question, what did he do? You haven't read that story? I'm telling you.
He put some objects before
Uh-huh. Okay.
And the, what the animals were looking upon that influenced the offspring there.
Yeah, it's possible that. It's also possible that the peeling of the bark and putting those in the water made something in the water do that as well. But he thought if the sheep, when they're mating, were mating in front of these poles that he had put in the water, that it would make them have more speckled sheep. And so that's kind of what he did. Either way, whatever the mechanism was that made it work, for him it was a surefire way of generating a larger flock of speckled and spotted sheep and goats. But Laban, being the trickster that he was, had something up his sleeve as well. Laban observed that all of a sudden Jacob started having more speckled sheep. And so what did he do? He separated and took away all the white sheep and the goats, and he was expecting his trick to work. But what happened with Jacob was that he did start having more sheep, and obviously he thought that it was a result of what he had done. And God certainly had his hand in that, I'm suspecting. But he thought it was the peeling of the bark of the trees and putting those things in where they drank their water. Have you ever had any luck? Anything that happened as a result of something you did, and you're so happy that that occurred, and then you find out it wasn't because of that at all? Or do you ever give an attribute of something happening because of something you did, and there's no way that that could have had anything to do with it? When you walk into a house, do you ever step on the threshold? I always step over it because I'm afraid if I step on that threshold, something bad's going to happen to me. That kind of thing, you know? You have these ideas about what may or may not work. Well, you may have thought something good happened because of something you did, but I don't think that's the case of what happened here with Jacob. We know that good things happen for bad people, right? We know that bad things happen for good people. God is the cause of all of that, the ultimate cause of everything in the universe. So does luck really have much to do with it? Well, Jacob's hopes and his plan, regardless, he finally came to see that it was nothing that he did caused the outcome. Now, how did he get to know that? How did he know that it was not anything I did that really caused me to have more sheep at the end of this period of time than my uncle Laban? You know, he puts a plan in place to make it happen, and he realized that God had his hand in it, because no matter what I did, it worked out to my benefit. No matter what happened, everything I planned to do, everything I didn't plan to happen, it didn't matter. Laban actually came later and said, "Hey, Jacob, I noticed after a year of this, I noticed you had a whole lot more sheep last year. I think I want you to leave, and I'll take the speckled sheep now, and you take the clear sheep." And then the second year, he came around and said, "You know what? I think we need to reverse that. I think we need to go back to the way it was." And Jacob couldn't do anything but say, "Yes, sir." And so that's what happened. Jacob began to understand that no matter what I did, Laban is going to undo what I did. And yet at the end of this, I wound up with more sheep. What's the cause of that? Nothing that I did. Had to be God's providence. Had to be God wanting that to happen a certain way. It's the only way it could have worked, is if God managed the outcome for him. So, finally, after Jacob's attempt to modify the impact of heredity on his decision, it was time for him to return to his homeland. And he had with him a bunch of spotted and speckled sheep. The trip would take about 19 days of walking, and I have a feeling it took a lot longer than that if you have sheep. Something tells me it would have taken those sheep longer to get there, and you'd have had to manage them along the way. But we know walking alone, if you were trying to do that, would take you about, in walking 10 hours a day, which is something I could never do, and something he also couldn't really do. If you think about having to stop along the way and water those sheep, and find food for them and water and everything, they couldn't just walk steadily through. Those what now? Oh, and the 12 kids would have, yeah, Dad, can we stop here at this store, and can we buy some stuff along the way? And pregnant women, yeah. So the group left. They set out on their way back to Canaan, but there was a fly in the ointment. Jacob knew the route he was taking would lead him and his family and all of his herd to go down and to get home. The best way to do it would be to stay on the path and go through Edom. Who was Edom? They were the cousins. His cousins were the Edomites, and they did not like the Israelites. And he knew that he's bringing this huge flock of sheep down. I've got to go through Edom in order to get home. I'm going to have to deal with it. It's the Jacob and Esau story all over again, really. It continued to happen because the Edomites were the ones that he was having to deal with. Well, it had been 20 years or so since Jacob had seen Esau or his group. And Jacob knew that he had tricked Esau earlier into getting his father's blessing. And Esau had to go live in the mountains in a very not agricultural area at all to the south of Jerusalem called Petra. And that's where he settled, in the whole area of the Edomites. And he figured for 20 years or so, Esau had been plotting his way to get even, and he knew he was going to have to deal with it when he came through there. And on the horizon, he sees a large group of soldiers advancing from the north to greet him. Can't you just imagine the fear that incited in Jacob? Because he didn't have an army to fight with at that point in time. Had he stepped out of the frying pan straight into the fire? Just before meeting Esau, the night before, Jacob had a dream. Again, with Jacob and his dreams, I don't get this. Before he lay his head down that night, he made some preparations. He moved his wives and servants and his possessions across the river to separate them from the men. So it was just him and the men, and he lay down and went to sleep. And I'm sure he was very tired when he finally did meet his brother Esau. And it's many things that we fear. There are a lot of things that we fear. Going to the doctor, for instance, and all of the things that go along with that. When you get there, you find out it really wasn't so bad. That shot I had to take didn't hurt that bad. You know, we do that. We fear things a lot, and that's just like what he was doing. Tax preparation, for instance. I mean, my heart beats fast every year at a certain time. How about a must-win football game, huh? Yeah. The results that you thought was going to happen didn't really happen. And that's true with Jacob. Now, during the night, he had a dream. An angel met with him and wrestled him. Now, I don't know if the World Wrestling Federation was invented back then, but it seems like they sure did enjoy wrestling in the Bible. And at some point in time, the angel touched his hip and threw his hip out of alignment. But he continued to fight on, and he struggled with that angel all night long. Jacob named this place Peniel because it meant that he had struggled with God and lived. Now, the Jews today, if you go eat with some Jewish people, you'll notice that they cut their ham so that they don't get the tendon in the middle. They don't get the meat in the ham hock. They would never consider eating ham hock, for instance, like you and I would, because that's the part that Jacob got wrestled out, and tradition holds that they're not going to eat that from, well, moving on. So Jacob attempted to pacify Esau right before he ever met him. He sent him all kinds of wonderful gifts ahead of Esau coming to see him. He sent him goats and rams and camels. I'm sure something that Esau didn't have, but he sent camels to him, cows and bulls and donkeys. He sent a whole bunch of animals to him. And all of these were offered as a gift to my brother Esau, hopefully going to take away some of Esau's anger. And clearly Jacob feared that a major skirmish was about to happen, right? What happened when the two came together? It wasn't what Jacob expected at all. Jacob bowed low before Esau, but Esau ran to him, grabbed him, scooped him up and said, "You don't have to bow to me, I'm your brother," and hugged him. And he was so glad to see him. He kissed him, and they both wept. It was the reunion that he would have hoped for, but he never expected ever to happen in his life. He was so glad that it turned out that way, I'm sure. Well, we know that another story here is Dinah and the Shechemites. I won't spend a lot of time with it, but the young man, Shechem, told his father, "Go get this girl for my wife." So they stole one of Jacob's granddaughters or daughters or someone in his family and allowed her to be taken away as permanent property. And Jacob knew he had to do some things, but he told the Hittites that they would all need to be circumcised before he could ever allow Dinah to be part of them. And believe it or not, they all agreed to do that. all of the soldiers, all of the men, those people who'd never been circumcised before, were told by the leader, go ahead and let's do that tonight. Well, unfortunately, before morning, when they were at the worst amount of pain possible, that's when they had their fight, and guess who won? Jacob got away from that one. He certainly was a trickster if you think about it that way. Jacob was told to return to Bethel. Not that he wanted to, but he was told to return there, and he did. This is where he had the stairway dream. So coming back to this holy site, it called for him to cleanse his entire family of any foreign gods that they may have been worshiping. He knew, I'm going to go meet with El, my God, and I need to get rid of all these foreign gods that I'm bringing with me. And they did that. And he built an altar there, just as Abraham had done. He laid out all the animal pieces, and when Abraham laid out all the animal pieces, walked through them. This was a reaffirmation of the covenant promise to all the people at the time of Abraham. And there, God blessed him to be a great nation and promised him to be a blessing of all people yet to be born. You know the story of the birth of Rachel's last son? All of her life, Rachel wanted children. Her only child was Joseph. So she begged God. She pleaded with Jacob. She used her handmaid to gain a son. And finally, God granted her wishes. She became pregnant, but in the process of childbirth, she died. Jacob renamed this young boy not Ben-Oni, but Benjamin, my right-hand man. We all know what's coming. Jacob's descendants flood into Canaan, but his descendants will soon be enslaved in Egypt for a very long time, 430 years to be in fact. Now, if you look at Israel then and today, it's basically the same story. Look how they were surrounded by enemies. They had the Aramites and the Ammonites and the Moabites. Well, even today, if you look at it, it's basically the same. They're still surrounded. Lebanon to the north, Syria, Jordan to the east, Egypt to the south. They're landlocked. They can't get away because you can't go into the ocean with people unless you have a lot of boats. So it's pretty much the same story that we have today. Well, thank you very much, folks.